Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Dr. John Endres. Let's get into our news stories of today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the huge pile of money that South African corporations are sitting on. We're also going to be talking a little bit about malnutrition and the differences that governance and policy choices can make. And lastly, we're going to be talking about a rather amusing name mix-up in the appointment of important figures in government. Okay, start off with our first story. The amount of money being held by South Africa's non-financial companies has apparently climbed by over 700 billion rand over the past 6 years, approaching 2 trillion at the end of July, as many companies across South Africa are worried about the climate and the future of their businesses, and so are stockpiling cash. The Reserve Bank's quarterly bulletin has shown that cash held by companies in their bank accounts amounted to a record 1.8 trillion rand by the end of July, up from 1.1 trillion reported in 2019. The bank said that companies are holding this excess cash because they're responding to economic conditions and balancing risk with readiness to invest when confidence returns. The Reserve Bank said cash holding thus increased significantly during the pandemic and subsequent high inflation period, and again when economic growth moderated from 2023 amidst increased global and domestic uncertainty. But since mid-2022, deposit growth has outpaced GDP growth, a sign that businesses are still keeping extra safe cash as a safety measure amid heightened uncertainty and limited investment opportunities. So, John, we've heard for years, for a very long time, by many groups on the left in South Africa's politics, COSATU, the EFF. They say that investors are on an investment strike, that they are punishing the government for its progressive policies, and that this has got nothing to do with businesses. It's all about the capitalists trying to destroy the progressive project. When you see that South African businesses are sitting on 1.8 trillion rand, is there any justification to that narrative?
I think a good starting point is to talk about whether 1.8 trillion is a big number, because it's sort of slightly out of the realm of our day-to-day grocery expenses. It's hard to understand, to put it into context.
Depends if you shop at Woolworths or not.
Exactly. So in that context, it's quite reasonable. But it is in fact about a quarter of our GDP. So if you take the value of all the goods and services South Africa produces in a country, that's about 7 trillion rand. And 1.8 trillion, it's sort of between a third and a quarter. So it's a very big amount of money. That's the first observation. The second one is that we keep harping on about gross fixed capital formation at the IRR. And we point out that fixed investment in South Africa is running at just 15% of GDP, when it should be at 25, 30, 35%, so far more than it is currently. And that spending is money that's spent on things like infrastructure, factories, roads, ports, all those hard assets made of steel and concrete and glass and so on. So there very clearly is a need for that kind of spending to happen. And that means the demand is there. And this 1.8 trillion rand cash hoard means the supply is there. So in other words, the money is there, it's available. South Africa's corporates have it. It's sitting in money markets, in their bank accounts. Why is it not being used to build railways and so on? And that is, of course, exactly what COSATU and also the government, like the ANC, will say. They will say, well, we need to spend that money and we've got the money, except we don't control it.
We need to take it.
Companies. Yes, exactly. And that's a real risk, one that we want to flag here. That the temptation will be great on the part of the ANC and left-wing parties and civil society organizations to say we have a very substantial need, and we've got a way of satisfying that need, which is to mobilize private sector funds in support of national economic development and infrastructure development, and therefore these resources should be taken, should be hijacked, should be expropriated, should be seized, should be confiscated, should be mobilized, whatever the word is that gets used. But that is what should happen. And probably the way it will be presented is that they will say, we're not seizing this money, but we're just going to pass a regulation that requires companies to invest X% of their cash holdings in government endorsed projects, like, I don't know, Transnet or Eskom or something like that, on which, of course, we will pay a return, and therefore, it's perfectly legitimate. But this is, as a matter of fact, a form of expropriation and a form of undermining property rights, because ultimately it's not the government's money to do with what it wants. That money belongs to the corporations, to the companies that have earned that money through their business operations, and it should be only up to them how they use that money. Now, we would like to see that money being spent on infrastructure and on bringing fixed investment up, but the way to make that happen is to make the companies want to do it and not force them to do it. And how do you make them want to do it? You create an attractive investment environment where you say your assets are safe from the threat of expropriation. Your assets are safe from crime because we're dealing with that problem finally. Your investments make sense because there's not this regulatory overburden of race-based laws and other threats to investment success. We're going to remove those threats, and then companies are going to deploy that money, and they're going to use that 1.8 trillion of their own free will to invest in that kind of project, and that is what needs to happen. So we'll see. I've got half a suspicion that we're going to see language coming out of the ANC, out of the left-wing organizations soon, pointing out that this 1.8 trillion must be used in the interests of the nation.
Yeah, it's sort of the other problem with all of this is that if South Africa was a country with much sort of stronger institutions and was just generally kind of better run, if it didn't have all these cadre networks and mafias in the state, if the government did get a hold of that money, let's just say, we ignore the damage to property rights that would happen if government confiscated. Let's say all these businesses just willingly gave it to the government. I don't know, because they were feeling nice that day. Just imagine the complete calamity of theft and corruption and chaos that would result from that huge pot of money being handed over. And we've seen this so many institutions across South Africa where money is just poured in and it's all diverted into inflated procurement processes, into misspending, into maladministration. And it's another reason why this money should be spent rather by the private sector rather than by government. This is why we should encourage these guys to spend this on investing in exactly the ways you pointed out, because it's just like with NHI, with Eskom, with any of these sort of big centralized pots, government, the temptation among the sort of cadre networks is just to basically take everything that isn't nailed to the floor. And until our institutions are strong enough to resist that kind of stuff, I don't think we can even think about, even imagine creating big pots of government money to be managed. Any more thoughts, John?
No, I agree with you. So I think a fair thing to point out, given our track record, our experience with our government, to mistrust its ability to spend money productively and honestly. And therefore, any attempts by the government to mobilize these resources on a coercive basis should be resisted very firmly and will be resisted by us.
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's move on to our next story. There has been the latest food security index that's come out from the grocery or the supermarket retailer ShopRite, which says that about 21% of children under the age of 5 in South Africa are stunted due to malnutrition, a rate which is unusually high for a middle-income country. In other words, a country with our amount of economic production and our sort of the government revenues that are available, we are getting sort of unusually low results. This kind of coincides with a statistic we've talked about on the show before, which came from the Minister of Health in answer to a parliamentary question, that nearly 4,500 children younger than 5 years old in South Africa have died in the past 5 years due to malnutrition. KZN having the most deaths, and the Western Cape the fewest. And this is just, the stunting of kids is really bad because it leaves these children and eventually these adults with many problems. Sometimes these problems can be difficulty learning. Sometimes these problems are just sort of recurring health issues that will continue for the rest of their lives. So they are likely to also, if you ignore the tremendous human impact, you just look at it from a purely sort of finance-based perspective, these people are all going to be requiring more medical assistance and more medical aid and more resources from our already struggling health system in the future. So it's, a calamity of enormous proportions, and it's just sort of coming down the pipeline. What was really interesting is the stark difference between the provinces. So you hear KZN's got the highest number of malnutrition deaths, the Western Cape the lowest. You think, okay, well, that makes sense. That's what we normally see as a pattern in South African data. But like, the scale of that difference is huge. In the last 5 years, 1,200 children died in KZN from malnutrition-related causes. In the Western Cape, that number was only 68. Now, that's 68 too many, but that is a huge difference. And John, you were sent by someone this piece of data on South Africa, which is on screen. I'll describe it for people who are listening only and not watching. It's a chart of middle-income countries and how many what the 1-year mortality of children per every 1,000 live births is on the left-hand axis, and on the bottom is per capita health expenditure. And you can see here that the Western Cape has massively different outcomes from the rest of South Africa. Indeed, we are basically kind of alongside the rest of the world, or the rest of the countries in that middle income bracket when it comes to kind of bang for our buck in terms of healthcare spending. But that's the rest of South Africa is in an absolutely shocking state. And when we see stories like the Tembisa looting, the story that's been going on recently, is it any surprise that this is the consequence of that? John, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, just crazy. So I'll start with the first statistic: 21% of children suffering stunting because of malnutrition. I think that's more than just bad. That is appalling and atrocious and a crime and indefensible. It is a consequence of poverty. I think that has to be said clearly. These are parents who have not got enough money to buy food for their children. Just imagine that. So when we keep going on at the IRR about economic growth, this is why. This is because there are kids who are not getting enough food out there in South Africa, in a middle-income country, in a country with all the resources, all the potential of South Africa. There are children going hungry and suffering health damage as a consequence of this. And it's an absolutely appalling outcome, one that cannot be condemned harshly enough. We've got to get this economy growing to prevent this from happening. And all of the stuff we do links together. It's all linked to economic growth. So the investment, that the cash holdings of the companies, the laws, the race-based laws, the expropriation laws, the looting, the not fighting the crime, it all comes back to this. You've got 20%, 1 in every 5 children in South Africa suffering from hunger and not being able to have enough food to eat because their parents are too poor. It is completely insane. It really is unbelievable. And then looking at that other chart, so you pointed out the difference between the Western Cape and the rest of South Africa. And I did notice that you said we, when you said Western Cape. Unfortunately, I cannot include myself in that group because I'm staying in the rest of South Africa outside the Western Cape.
But I've already assimilated, apparently. I didn't even notice that.
Yes, you see. So if you don't mind, just bring that chart up again. I want you to tell our listeners, sort of share an observation there, which is that the infant mortality rate, so that's children under 1 year of age, according to this chart for South Africa as a whole, where South Africa spends $390 per capita in the public health system, the infant mortality rate is the same as the lowest ranking, so the highest ranking country on infant mortality, which is spending, eyeballing it, $30 per child. So our outcome in terms of children dying is the same as a country that is spending 1/10 on public health as South Africa. That is how crazy this is. So yeah, I mean, if ever we needed motivation for our work, and why we keep going on about economic growth and reforms and getting this country right, that's all the justification you need. And I hope that viewers out there also realize this. If you care about this sort of thing, about people's actual lives, of children, of babies, of adults, about life expectancy, and you want these things to get better, you've got to get pushing behind every single actor that exists in civil society and in the political space that is fighting for high economic growth rates. That's like a moral obligation on you to do this. You can support the IRR, and we hope you do, but there's other organizations doing this out there as well. Support them as well, because you can be saving lives by pushing for policy changes that make the economy grow. Okay.
Yeah, it just shows really the impact that governance does have on real material outcomes. I mean, you think about the Western Cape. Obviously, its healthcare system has its problems. Obviously, I'm sure if you talk to any official in the Western Cape government, they would say, "Oh, this was misspent," or "There's too much, there isn't enough money," or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, even with implementing national health policy, which is not exactly the health policy that I would design if I was given total power of these things, there are significant improvements over the rest of the country. The rest of the country, without changing anything except that sort of level of management, that commitment to meritocracy, that sort of stuff that we see in the Western Cape, could be at that level. Now, we could get it much lower. If you notice, I mean, even the Western Cape, I think, is still kind of a bit higher than a lot of the other countries on that chart there. But so that number could definitely be low. We should ideally be the best performing country in the world in our bracket. But even relatively small changes in governance can have huge material impacts on people's lives, and I think that is extremely important to remember. And it's also why, when people kind of just give up on politics and get disenchanted and say, all the politicians are the same, what's the difference, blah blah blah. This is the difference. This actually is the difference of real implementations of proper changes to society. And that's measured in lives.
Exactly. And I sort of want to go off script here for a moment, Nicholas. So this is a story we haven't talked about, but an observation which I think it is important to share. And that is that you get some people sort of with quite a cynical view of corruption. And they'll say, look, no, sure, some people are going to skim off a bit of the top or steal a bit of money. But ultimately, the money stays circulating in the economy, and whether it gets spent in one place or the other doesn't actually make that much difference. And you'll hear that sort of argument. I want to point out to those people, Tembisa Hospital. So this is a public hospital where people go who are sick, who are dying, who are needing help to be treated. And out of this hospital, out of this facility, 2 billion rand has been stolen. That is 2 billion rand that is missing for medicine, for medical devices, for X-ray machines, for cancer treatment, for hospital bedding, for food for patients, for hygiene, for cleaning, for the staff. That is 2 billion rand missing from saving people's lives and from treating people who are sick. So I don't buy that argument that corruption is a victimless crime and the money keeps circulating. No, it makes a difference where the money gets spent. And that is a really good example of that. So on the one hand, you've got sort of sick and dying people at Tembisa Hospital suffering. On the other side, you've got these amazing images of the house in Hyde Park or Sandhurst, wherever it is, on a 12,000 square meter property with 4 blue Lamborghinis. It's just obscene. It is terrible. So yes, does governance matter? Yes, it matters. These numbers show it. Does corruption matter? Yes, it matters. These numbers show it. So all of this stuff really matters. This is not abstract.
How many Lamborghinis does a man need? Apparently more than one. I don't know when you have time to drive them all, because imagine driving them on our pothole roads. It just doesn't, it doesn't seem like
maybe there were 4 people living in that house, so maybe each of them needed a Lamborghini.
Yeah, even then, it just seems like it's like such a hassle to just go up to the Pick and Pay to get to get your groceries in the Lamborghini. Sorry, the Pick and Pay. I'm completely talking out of my backside here. The Woolworths.
I was going to say yes.
Just obscene, over the top, kind of grotesque, and that's why this is ironically the thing that kind of can drive people into socialism. Is they think, they see this kind of ridiculous, obscene wealth being splashed around by these crony capitalists, and they think, oh well, this means that capitalism is bad. No, this is a perversion of capitalism. Not to go all real capitalism hasn't been tried, but in our context, I think there is some truth to that claim that real capitalism hasn't been tried. And the consequence is corruption and maladministration. Speaking of maladministration, let's move on to our last story, which is rather more lighthearted than our previous two. Now, I kept getting my tongue twisted in trying to explain this in the pre-show chat, so apologies if I get this a little bit wrong. But basically, the finance minister Enoch Godongwana has said that he announced on X in a statement that they would be onboarding new directors for the Public Investment Corporation, and one of these people was Mpolelo Maseko, who is a former PIC employee. Unfortunately, they didn't put Mpolelo Maseko on. They didn't onboard Mpolelo Maseko. They onboarded Mpulalelo Maseko, who was a former Treasury official and a completely different person. The mistake was only discovered last week, and Mpulalelo was asked to resign and make way for the person they actually meant to appoint. This was revealed in an interview on Sunday. Godongwana said he did not know how the mistake had happened, but planned to rectify it by appointing the correct person. And there have been a number of awkward and embarrassing things in terms of appointments to big government bodies recently. In June, the Public Investment Corporation, the Industrial Development Corporation, appointed someone to their board as a director, despite the fact that this person had a dispute with the Industrial Development Corporation worth 70 million rands over a loan. And in August, a number of people were put forward on the Transport Economic Regulator board as names, and then a whole bunch of them had major issues with them. And this was suddenly just retracted in the second version of the statement that went out without any explanation. So clearly, things are not going particularly well in government right now. I mean, the finance department is generally considered one of the most professional and well-run parts of the government. And to see such an embarrassing mix-up like this, where you appoint someone with a similar sounding name to a position, is not great.
Yeah. So I think one of the things for us to look out for is going to be ANC missteps, because our hypothesis is that as the ANC is under increasing pressure from many different angles, it's going to start making more and more mistakes. And I think this is one example of that. So they're slipping up because they're not concentrating properly. If you've got your financial crisis, as the party does have at the moment, you're under pressure electorally with your polling numbers dropping. You've got the Americans placing pressure on you. All of this is going to be a distraction. It'll make it hard to focus on stuff. And I think this is where we're seeing some of these mistakes come from. On this, I do want to point out one thing, which is that the person who's now being appointed to the PIC board, Mpumelo Maseko, used to work at the Isibaya Fund, which is a fund of the Public Investment Corporation. And that is one of those funds that invests or provides finance to BEE entrepreneurs. And the article we read has this very telling line. So it provides much sought after finance to BEE entrepreneurs, among others, and tolerates an extremely high level of impairments. What does that mean? That means that this fund is lending money to people who don't pay it back. That's what it means. An extremely high level of impairments. And on other episodes on this show, we've been talking about the Transformation Fund, right? So we've got the Trade and Industry Minister.
I forgot to mention that earlier.
Yeah. Who wants to set up, 100 billion rand transformation fund to finance BE entrepreneurs. But already they've got funds like this with extremely high levels of impairment. So they're basically wasting money, losing money. And this new fund is going to do the same thing. So not great. And I think one of the things it shows us is that it's the size of the government that's the problem. The more resources the state takes for itself, tax share as a tax share of GDP, which is like around a third of GDP gets taken by the government in South Africa, the more opportunity there is for looting, to steal money, etc., etc. And that is not to say that the ideal size of government is zero. There's very much a role for government to play. But we have a very large government, and we've got a very incompetent and very compromised government in many areas. And I think it's a very strong argument for reducing its size.
And one of the areas in which our government is weakest is unfortunately the most important aspect of government, which is ensuring law and order, protecting property rights, doing the basics of policing and courts and justice. And that is unfortunately, as we're seeing in the headlines every single day, not in a great place right now. So maybe there should be a little bit more focus on that. Than,
exactly.
All of the many prestige projects that government continuously sort of regurgitates out. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. I know, John, you have to run to something now, but thank you very much for watching, and we hope you found the show interesting. We will see you tomorrow with the podcast report, and then we'll be back with normal episodes on Thursday and Friday. Cheers, everyone, and have a great day. The Daily Friend Show and The Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.